The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful counterpoint to the pre-dawn gloom. Arthur Penhaligon stepped inside the Blue Plate diner, the aroma of frying bacon and stale coffee a familiar comfort. "Morning, Dolores Maria," he called out, hanging his worn leather jacket on the rack near the entrance. Dolores, the cook, a woman whose apron strained against her ample figure, grunted a greeting, her focus unwavering as she flipped a stack of pancakes. Maria, wiping down the counter with a practiced hand, offered a warmer smile. "Arthur, your early coffee's just brewed." He nodded, a faint smile gracing his lips, and walked behind the counter. His movements precise and economical, he knew this dance by heart. First, the hand-washing, a ritualistic cleansing that always made him feel a little lighter. Then, the meticulous arrangement of his station. Silverware gleaming, napkins folded into neat triangles, sugar dispensers filled to the brim, each salt and pepper shaker aligned perfectly. It was more than just setting up for the day. It was about imposing order on a world that often felt chaotic. Old Man Hemmings was already perched on his usual stool, nursing a mug of coffee and reading the newspaper. "Morning, Arthur," he rasped without looking up. "Mr. Hemmings," Arthur replied, his voice a gentle baritone. "Anything I can get you started with?" "Just the usual," Hemmings mumbled, turning a page. "Keep the coffee comin'." Arthur poured Hemmings a fresh cup, the dark liquid steaming in the dim light that he knew Mr. Hemmings' routine as well as his own. A stack of pancakes, extra syrup, and a side of bacon, crispy but not burnt. He glanced at the clock above the grill. 5:58 a.m. Almost time for the regulars to arrive. As he waited, Arthur caught his reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. A network of fine lines etched around his eyes, a testament to years of laughter and, he knew, more than a few sleepless nights. His gaze lingered on the jagged scar that bisected his left cheek, a stark white line against his tanned skin. He unconsciously touched it. The phantom pain, a familiar ache, the desert wind, hot and unforgiving, whipping sand against his face. The sudden explosion, a blinding flash of light and deafening roar, the searing pain, then nothing. He snapped back to the present, the clatter of dishes and the sizzle of bacon grounding him. He shook his head, forcing the memory back into its box. Those days were over. This was his life now. The Blue Plate diner was his sanctuary. The door jingled again, and Mrs. Gable, a sweet elderly woman with a penchant for gossip and blueberry pie, shuffled in, followed by Tom, the construction worker, his hard hat perched on the edge of his seat. "Morning, everyone," Mrs. Gable chirped, her eyes twinkling. "Morning, Mrs. Gable, Tom." Arthur greeted them warmly. "The usual?" Tom nodded, already eyeing the bacon on the grill. Mrs. Gable, however, hesitated. "Arthur, dear, that new boy, the one who works at the hardware store, he was asking about you yesterday. Said he saw you wearing a veteran's hat at the grocery store." Arthur felt a flicker of discomfort. He didn't talk about his past. It was a closed book, best left unopened. "Did he now?" he said, carefully avoiding her gaze as he began preparing Tom's breakfast platter. "Yes, he was quite curious," Mrs. Gable continued, oblivious to his discomfort. "Said he admired your service." Arthur placed the steaming plate in front of Tom, the aroma of bacon filling the air. He forced a smile, the effort feeling strained. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Gable. Just doing my job." He knew the question was coming, the one he always dreaded. The one that would force him to acknowledge the life he tried so hard to forget. A Beaumont arrival. The bell above the diner door announced their arrival with an almost violent clang, shattering the midday peace like a dropped plate. Sunlight momentarily bleached the interior as the trio stepped inside, silhouetting them against the dusty street. Richard Beaumont too led the charge, a man carved from granite and self-satisfaction. Behind him, like a hesitant shadow, came Chadwick Beaumont III, practically swimming in his ROTC uniform. Bringing up the rear was a woman draped in so much jewelry she tinkled with every movement, her face obscured behind oversized sunglasses. Chad shuffled nervously, tugging at the collar of his crisp, starched uniform. The fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar, a costume he wore more for his father than himself. The brass buttons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, Reflecting his own anxious face back at him in miniature, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the chrome trim of a nearby booth, and felt a blush creep up his neck. He looked ridiculous, like a boy, playing soldier. He desperately wanted to loosen his tie but feared drawing his father's attention. Richard stopped abruptly, surveying the room with the disdain of a king inspecting a peasant village. His gaze lingered on a chipped Formica tabletop, then flickered towards the faded floral wallpaper. "This establishment has a seating arrangement?" he finally boomed, his voice carrying through the diner like a foghorn. The hostess, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda, hurried forward, a practiced smile plastered on her face. "Right this way, sir." "Table for 3. Richard sniffed, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Ideally, yes. Though I see a distinct lack of refinement. Is there anywhere less public?" He gestured vaguely with a hand that sported a thick gold ring. "Perhaps a booth? Away from the general populace." Brenda's smile tightened. "All our booths are occupied right now, sir. But I can offer you a table by the window." "Unacceptable." Richard's voice was flat, dismissive. "We will wait for a booth. And ensure it is thoroughly cleaned. I trust you understand." He stared at Brenda, his eyes like chips of ice, daring her to disagree. Chad felt a pang of sympathy for the woman. His stomach twisting with discomfort, he wanted to say something, anything, to diffuse the situation. But the words caught in his throat. He knew what was coming: the lecture later, the disappointment, the feeling of inadequacy that always seemed to follow these encounters. He focused on the worn linoleum floor, tracing the faded pattern with his eyes, anything to avoid the confrontation unfolding before him. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clatter of silverware from the kitchen and the nervous shuffling of Chad's feet. He could feel the weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. He just wanted to disappear. First impressions. Arthur approached the table, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Good evening, folks. Welcome to the Blue Plate. Can I get you started with anything to drink?" The scent of stale coffee clung to his apron, a familiar comfort in the chaotic symphony of the diner. The older man, radiating an air of entitled impatience, fixed Arthur with a steely gaze. "Took you long enough. We've been sitting here practically invisible. I'll have a scotch, neat, and make it snappy." Arthur swallowed, the smile faltering. "I'm sorry for the wait, sir. We're a little short-staffed tonight. I'm afraid we don't serve hard liquor here, but we have a selection of orange juice." The man interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Just get me orange juice. And make sure it's fresh, not that watered-down garbage you probably serve." His companion, a younger man with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dad, really? It's fine. Water's okay for me." Richard Beaumont too ignored his son. "And you?" he said, turning back to Arthur, his gaze lingering on the jagged scar that bisected Arthur's left cheek. "What happened to your face? Looks like you went 10 rounds with a badger." Chad's cheeks flushed crimson. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the vinyl of the booth. "Dad, please," he mumbled, barely audible. The scar, he thought, gave the waiter a certain ruggedness, a story etched onto his skin. Arthur's smile vanished completely, replaced by a weary resignation. He'd heard it all before, the whispers, the stares, the thinly veiled disgust. "It's an old injury, sir," he said, his voice flat. "Orange juice and water. Then, don't get snippy with me," Richard snapped. "Just get the drinks. And try to be a little faster next time. Some of us have places to be." He adjusted his tie, the silk gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights as Arthur turned to fetch the drinks. Chad caught his eye. He offered a small, apologetic smile. Arthur merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Chad watched him walk away, his stomach twisting with a knot of guilt. His father's behavior was appalling, but he never knew how to stand up to him. He always ended up complicit, a silent observer in his father's casual cruelty. He wished he were brave enough to say something, anything to make things right. He noticed the way Arthur favored his left arm ever so slightly. He wondered about the story behind the scar, the one his father had so rudely demanded. He imagined a battlefield, a rescue, some act of selfless heroism. The orange juice suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth, under pressure. This coffee tastes like it's been brewed since you got that thing on your face, old-timer, Richard boomed, loud enough for half the diner to hear. Arthur, balancing a tray laden with a precarious tower of onion rings, felt his grip tighten. He didn't look up, just placed the rings carefully on a nearby table, mumbled, "Enjoy," and returned to Richard's booth. "More coffee, sir?" Arthur asked, his voice betraying none of the anger churning inside him. Years of practice had honed his ability to mask his emotions, to become a blank slate in the face of adversity. The scar, a jagged reminder of a past he desperately tried to bury, was a lightning rod for the cruelty of the world. "Took you long enough?" Richard snapped, thrusting his mug forward. "Maybe if you weren't so ancient, you'd be quicker on your feet." Chad, seated opposite his father, felt a flush creep up his neck as he fiddled with the silver cufflink on his crisply pressed uniform shirt. The Beaumont family crest digging into his skin, he wanted to say something, anything, to stop his father, but the words caught in his throat, choked by years of ingrained obedience. He risked a glance at Arthur. The man's shoulders were rigid beneath his blue shirt, his jaw tight, but his expression remained carefully neutral as he refilled the mug. "Thank you, sir," Arthur said, his voice steady. He wiped a non-existent spill from the table with a practiced hand, avoiding eye contact. "Don't thank me, just do your job?" Richard scoffed. He took a loud sip of the coffee, then grimaced. "Still tastes like dirt. Probably the only thing you know how to serve. Dirt." Chad's hands clenched into fists under the table. He could taste the bile rising in his throat. He noticed the way Arthur's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he placed the coffee pot back on its warmer. He imagined the stories etched onto that face, the battles fought, the pain endured. His father, safe in his ivory tower, had no right. Arthur moved to take their order. "And what can I get for you gentlemen?" "I'll have the steak. Rare. And make sure it's actually rare. Not whatever shoe leather you usually serve here." Richard sneered. He tapped a manicured finger impatiently on the laminated menu. "And hurry it up, I don't have all day to wait on some geriatric waiter." "Yes, sir," Arthur said, scribbling on his pad. He turned to Chad. "And you, sir?" Chad swallowed hard. I'll have the same. Please. Medium rare." He finally met Arthur's gaze, offering a small, apologetic smile. Arthur's eyes, a startling shade of blue, flickered with something Chad couldn't quite decipher: sadness, resignation, or maybe a spark of defiance. Arthur nodded curtly and walked towards the kitchen, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. Chad watched him go, a knot of guilt twisting in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that surprised even him, that he couldn't let this continue. He had to do something. The snapped fingers. Arthur refilled Richard Beaumont's water glass, the ice clinking a fragile symphony against the thick crystal. He hadn't spoken, hadn't even met Richard's eye. He just performed his duties, a silent, almost spectral presence. Richard, meanwhile, hadn't stopped complaining about the weight, the temperature of the iced tea, too sweet, then not sweet enough, and the quality of the napkins. Chad, across from his father, shifted uncomfortably, picking at a loose thread on his crisp, starched military school uniform. He wished he could disappear, melt into the patterned wallpaper of the Blue Plate diner. "Honestly, Arthur, is it too much to ask for some decent service?" Richard boomed, his voice carrying through the already bustling diner. A few heads turned, and Chad felt his cheeks flush. He mumbled, "Dad, maybe you could?" Richard cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Don't start, Chadwick. I'm paying for this. I expect a certain level of competence." He glared at Arthur, who remained impassive, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the diner's window. Arthur's face was a roadmap of past traumas. The most prominent feature was a thick, puckered scar that traced a jagged path from his temple down to his jawline. Chad had noticed it immediately when they were seated at it. Spoke of violence, of a life lived hard. His own life, insulated by privilege and expectation, felt suddenly small and insignificant. Richard snapped his fingers. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the diner. "Arthur, I need more sweetener. And this time, try to get it right." The snap was the spark that landed on the tinder of Chad's simmering discomfort and ignited a small, rebellious flame that he saw something flicker in Arthur's eyes, not anger, but a profound sadness, a weary acceptance that made Chad's stomach clench. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror after disappointing his father, but on Arthur, hardened by years and etched with scars, it was devastating. Chad had always been taught to respect his elders, to obey his father. It was drilled into him at home and at the academy. But this felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. He felt a prickle of sweat on his brow, his heart hammering against his ribs. The carefully constructed walls of obedience and ingrained politeness he'd built around himself began to crack. He looked at his father, really looked at him, at the cruel line of his mouth, the entitled glint in his eyes. That he saw not the imposing figure he'd always revered, but a petty, insecure man trying to feel powerful by belittling someone he perceived as weaker. Arthur turned to retrieve the sweetener. His movements slow, almost deliberate. Chad watched him, his jaw tight. He looked down at his own hands, the nails neatly trimmed, the skin smooth and unblemished. Then, he looked back up at his father. The flame inside him flared brighter. He couldn't stay silent at a son's stand. The clatter of Richard's fork against his untouched eggs felt like a starting pistol. This is pathetic, Chad. Utterly pathetic. I could get better service and better food at a roadside ditch. Arthur, clearing a nearby table, flinched almost imperceptibly. Chad saw it. The brief tightening around Arthur's eyes, a flicker of something dark and deeply buried. Chad pushed back his chair. The linoleum squeaked under its legs, a sound that seemed amplified in the suddenly hushed diner. His father looked up, eyebrows arched in haughty amusement. "What now, son? Finally going to agree with me about this?" Chad cut him off. "No, Dad. I'm not." He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. This was it. The moment he dreaded and, secretly, yearned for. He turned, his gaze meeting Arthur's. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking only slightly. "I am so sorry. My father. He doesn't always think before he speaks." Richard sputtered, his face turning a shade of puce that matched the diner's vinyl booths. "Chadwick, what in the world do you think you're doing?" Chad ignored him, keeping his eyes fixed on Arthur. "You've been nothing but polite and efficient. He's just being difficult." He felt a flush creeping up his neck, mirroring the heat on his father's face. Arthur simply stared, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Chad plowed on, desperate. "Look, I know this uniform. It probably doesn't mean much to you. I joined ROTC because I thought it would make my dad happy. Because I'm not sure what else I'm good at." He fidgeted with the stiff collar, suddenly acutely aware of how starched and uncomfortable it felt. "But seeing you working here, you've actually earned the right to wear a uniform, a real one. And I admire that. A lot." He glanced down, unable to meet Arthur's gaze any longer. The worn floor tiles were suddenly fascinating. He could feel his father's incredulous stare boring into the side of his head. "Chadwick," Richard finally managed, his voice dangerously low, "get back in your seat. Now." Chad didn't move. He risked a glance back at Arthur, who was still standing there, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. A scar bisected that smile, a stark reminder of something Chad couldn't even begin to imagine. He turned back to his father, his voice gaining strength. "No, Dad. I won't. Not this time." The words felt like a release, a dam breaking within him. He stood a little taller, the uncomfortable ROTC uniform suddenly feeling a little less like a costume and a little more like armor, scars of valor. Arthur polished the already gleaming countertop, the diner's fluorescent glare bouncing off the wedding band on his finger. Chad's earlier words, hesitant and murmured, had taken root deep inside him. He hadn't confessed anything of substance in what felt like ages. "Say," Arthur began, his voice grating with disuse, "that blemish. It wasn't from a coffee mishap, Mr. Beaumont." He indicated his temple with the cleaning rag. Richard Beaumont too scoffed. "I gathered that much. Some drunken brawl, I imagine." Chad leveled a scorching glare at his father. "Dad." Then he faced Arthur, genuine concern creasing his brow. "You're under no obligation to share anything." Arthur offered Chad a faint, melancholic smile. "Kandahar. We were pinned. taking fire. A boy, barely older than you now, was about to catch an RPG. Instinct took over. I moved. He paused, his gaze drifting. The blast got me instead. Shrapnel shower. He touched the scar gingerly. Could have been far worse. Could have been him gone instead. The diner seemed to hush. Even the kitchen's clamor receded to a faint background drone. Chad fixed on Arthur, his young features reflecting a blend of awe and sorrow. The polished veneer of military academy training cracked, revealing a boy overwhelmed by the weight of Arthur's revelation. "That's extraordinary," Chad breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved a life. That's heroic." Arthur glanced down at his hands, weathered and marked. "Heroes exist in fables. Kid. I simply did what felt right." Richard Beaumont too cleared his throat, the sound a sharp intrusion on the stillness. "Yes, quite touching. But could we return to our order? My coffee is losing its heat." He nudged his cup towards Arthur with a dismissive flick of the wrist. Chad's head snapped up, a spark of resolve igniting in his gaze. "Dad, enough." His tone held a surprising firmness, an authority Arthur wouldn't have anticipated. "Show some decency. This man risked everything for our country." Richard sputtered, his face flushing crimson. "Chadwick, do not address me in that manner." Chad stood firm, squaring his shoulders. "No, Dad. You listen. We are staying. We will finish our meal, and we will treat Mr. Penhaligon with the respect he's earned. As that understood." The silence lengthened, heavy as a shroud. Richard Beaumont too scowled at his son, his expression a rigid mask of anger. But for the first time, Chad didn't yield. He met his father's stare, unflinching, until finally Richard's defiance crumbled, muttering under his breath. Arthur observed the exchange, a warmth blossoming in his chest. He retrieved Richard's cup and went back to the counter. He poured a fresh brew, his movements precise and controlled. Returning to the table, he caught Chad's eye and gave a subtle nod of gratitude. A link, forged in shared respect and a quiet act of rebellion, was now established. The diner's verdict. A low hum of disapproval rippled through the blue plate. A woman with bright pink hair and even brighter pink lipstick, sitting in a booth near the window, spoke first. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a surprising amount of steel. "But I think you owe that gentleman an apology." She gestured towards Arthur with a forkful of what looked like scrambled eggs. Richard Beaumont too bristled, his face reddening. "I hardly think." "Oh, stuff it, Richard." A gruff voice interrupted. It belonged to a man in a trucker hat, nursing a mug of coffee at the counter. "Arthur's been serving folks here for years. He's a good man, scar or no scar. You got no right talking to him like that." Suddenly, the diner erupted in a chorus of agreement. A waitress, wiping down a table, chimed in. "He's practically family here. Richard, show some respect." Another patron, a wizened old woman with a mischievous glint in her eye, added. "Used to be, folks respected their elders. Guess some people just forgot their manners." Richard's bluster deflated like a punctured tire. He glanced around the diner, his eyes darting from face to face. Every gaze was fixed on him, a mixture of disapproval and outright hostility. He cleared his throat. The sound amplified in the suddenly quiet room. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on him, heavier than any boardroom decision. Chad, emboldened by the unexpected support, met his father's gaze. There was a pleading in his eyes, a silent urging to do the right thing. Richard, defeated and visibly uncomfortable, mumbled, all right, I apologize. To the waiter. He avoided eye contact with Arthur, focusing instead on a rogue crumb on the tablecloth. Arthur, his face unreadable, simply nodded. "Thank you, sir." The tension in the air didn't dissipate, though it lingered, thick and uncomfortable, like the smell of burnt toast. The Beaumont family's breakfast, once a symbol of their privilege, had become a spectacle of their shame. Chad picked at his pancakes, the syrup now tasting like ashes in his mouth. His mother stared blankly at her plate, seemingly trying to disappear into the floral wallpaper. Richard, his appetite vanished, pushed his plate away. The clatter of the ceramic against the table sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The pink-haired woman resumed eating but kept her eye on the Beaumonts. The trucker returned to his coffee. A satisfied grunt escaping his lips, the old woman chuckled softly. As if enjoying a private joke, the Blue Plate Diner, a simple establishment, had delivered its verdict. Richard Beaumont, too, for all his wealth and power, had been found wanting. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that this breakfast, this humiliation, would be a story whispered in the town for years to come. And he knew, even more acutely, that he had lost something far more valuable than face. He had lost the respect of his son. Apple pie and respect. The bell above the diner door jingled, announcing the Beaumonts' departure. Arthur waited until their taillights disappeared down Main Street before letting out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease, replaced by a weary gratitude. He found Chad lingering near the counter, fiddling with the silver button on his crisp ROTC uniform. "Chad," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Thank you." Chad looked up, startled, his cheeks flushing a light pink. "It was nothing, Mr. Penhaligon. Really, it wasn't nothing to me." Arthur stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You stood up for me, Tio, your father. That takes courage, son, real courage." He extended a hand, calloused and scarred, and Chad took it in a firm, earnest shake. It wasn't right," Chad mumbled, still avoiding eye contact. "He shouldn't have said those things." Arthur chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Well, he said them, but you fixed it. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost a long time ago." He paused, then added, "Respect." He gestured toward the gleaming glass pie case. "Come on, let me cut you a slice of my apple pie on the house. Best in the county, I promise." Chad's face lit up. "Seriously? That would be awesome." Arthur beamed, a genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He retrieved a warm, golden-brown pie from the case, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples filling the air. He cut a generous slice, the flaky crust crumbling slightly under the knife. He slid it onto a plate and presented it to Chad with a flourish. "My treat." Chad took a bite, his eyes widening. "Wow, Mr. Penhaligon, you're right. This is incredible." He ate with gusto, the sweetness of the pie a comforting balm after the unpleasantness of the afternoon. As Chad savored the pie, Arthur watched him, a quiet satisfaction settling in his heart. He felt vindicated, not just for himself, but for all the unseen scars, the unspoken burdens carried by people every day. Chad's simple act of kindness had been a powerful antidote to the poison of prejudice. Richard Beaumont too sat in the back seat of the Lincoln, staring out the window at the blur of passing trees. He didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge his son's presence. The apology he'd been forced to utter still tasted like ash in his mouth. He replayed the scene in his mind. The waitress's gasp, his son's unexpected defiance, the hushed silence of the diner, Arthur Penhaligon's quiet dignity. A flicker of something akin to shame stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years perhaps. He thought, just perhaps, he had been wrong. The thought was unsettling, unfamiliar. He continued to stare out the window, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across his face, leaving his intentions shrouded in twilight.